Okay, so I'm here in Switzerland to explore the Alps and to see a concert, but there's something on my mind that I want to talk about today. One of the things that the Swiss are known for, other than maybe watches and chocolate, are their trains. The Swiss have a fantastic train network, and part of that reputation is because of this clock, which you can find at pretty much every train station across the country. But what's so special about this clock? Well, the second hand is a little weird. If you look a little closer, the second hand sweeps along the face, just like a normal clock, but then it just stops. And this pause of the second hand and the story behind it is the reason why Swiss trains are known for being some of the most punctual in the world. Let me explain. I've been traveling around Switzerland the last few days using pretty much just the train network, and this clock is everywhere I go. In fact, today there are about 3,000 of this exact clock all over the country. But railway stations all having the same clock isn't that unusual. I mean, they're all operated by the same company, the SBB. What is unusual is that pause the second hand does between every minute. And there's an explanation for that. But first, we have to learn about the history of the railroads themselves. Back during World War I, there was a shortage of coal all throughout Europe. Most of the coal being mined was being used to power tanks and military transport. And so Switzerland, who remained neutral during the war, didn't have coal to power their trains. And so after the war ended, the Swiss really worked on electrifying their railways to reduce their dependence on foreign coal. And by the Second World War, 77% of Swiss railways were electric compared to 5% in the rest of Europe. And so with electric trains, rail transportation got a lot cheaper, and so people started traveling more. And so to meet that demand, railroad companies started offering more trains and more segments and more routes. But as the number of trains grew, it got more and more difficult to keep the trains running on time because, as it turns out, the stations weren't very good at keeping time. So back then, each train station in Switzerland kept its own time, meaning the clock at one station could reach midday a little sooner than the clock at another. And these little discrepancies could wreak havoc on a system that's very sensitive to delays. And so one of the first things that the Swiss railways do when they recognize this problem is to sync up the clocks at each station. And remember, this was an era before global time networks and the internet. So in order to sync up time between the stations, they had to be a little more clever. And so what do they do to sync up the clocks? Well, telephones were already in use back then. And so the Swiss were like, why not use this existing infrastructure to sync up the clocks? But not like calling each station and telling them what to set their clocks to, but actually sending a signal like a pulse of a certain frequency across the telephone lines to sync up the clocks. Okay, cool. So the railroad clocks all across Switzerland are synced down to the minute using telephone lines by 1944. And at the same time, they also standardized the faces that they use. So they all look like this. Pretty close to what the clocks look like today, except, wait, no second hand. Well, as it turns out, it took another 10 years for them to add the second hand because there's a lot more engineering going on behind that than you might have imagined. So, behind a lot of the history that we've been talking about today is a man named Hans Hilfiger. Hilfiger actually had a hand in electrifying the railways after World War I, and he was actually the person who designed this very handsome clock face to begin with. Hilfiger actually first started playing with the idea of a second hand in 1943, a year before the standardization. But it wasn't until 1953 that he actually figured out how to implement it. That's because adding a synchronized second hand, using technology at the time, wasn't very reliable. You see, stepper motors, the kind that tick and are used to move the minute hand, weren't very reliable back then. And since a stepper motor powering the second hand would have to tick 60 times more often than the stepper motor in the minute hand, they would fail a lot more often. But on the other hand, synchronous AC motors, the kind that can move smoothly, were more reliable, but they weren't very accurate, meaning they could rotate a little fast or a little slow. And that's not very useful if you're trying to keep time. You see, Swiss trains always leave at the top of the minute, so if the conductor was reading the clock that day and the second hand was a little behind the minute hand, it would mess up the timetables. And so Hans Hilfiger invented this clever little mechanism to ensure that the second hand always synced up with the minute hand, and that was by purposely running the second hand fast. So he uses a more reliable AC motor, but instead of calibrating it to do a full rotation in 60 seconds, he runs it a little faster, doing a full rotation in about 58.5 seconds. And then once the second hand reaches the top, it waits. A little pin actually holds the second hand in place while the clutch for the motor disengages. And and then the second hand is held there until a signal arrives indicating that the next minute has arrived. And then once that signal arrives from the central control station in Zurich, the minute hand ticks over and the second hand is released, and it's free to keep rotating. And what's clever about this solution is that even if the second hand was running a little fast, it'll just get there a little sooner and have to wait a little longer. Or even if the motor was a little slower that day, as long as it arrived before 60 seconds is up, it would still be in sync with the minute hand. And since all Swiss trains leave at the top of the minute, it didn't matter if the second hand was inaccurate during most of its rotation, as long as every clock at every station all across Switzerland ticked over the next minute at exactly the same moment. So this specific innovation helped increase the punctuality of Swiss trains a lot. And importantly, with the addition of the second hand, conductors could actually anticipate when the next minute would arrive, meaning that trains could leave the station with more precision. So here's the question that's been on my mind after seeing this clock all around Switzerland the last few days. Why does it still stop? Like, isn't all of this unnecessary now? Why does the second hand still stop? Like, look at the clock on this display. The second hand still stops even though there's no mechanical movement behind it. I mean, the reason why Hans Hilfiger designed a second hand that would stop in the first place was to get around a technical limitation of early clocks. But now that we have computer-controlled time that can be synced down to a fraction of a millisecond, why does the second hand still stop at the top of the minute? Well, as it turns out, it's because people liked it. Or at least they were used to it. There was a certain drama to it, like in a movie where you can hear the clock ticking, then all of a sudden it goes silent, and then the action starts. The original designer, Hans Hilfiger, even spoke on this. The clock pauses in anticipation right before the train takes off, and everyone gets to see that. And it was kind of charming. When the second hand with its red disc at the end started moving, it reminded people of station masters who would wave at trains to signal to them that it was time to leave. But even when engineering had permitted clocks to be accurate without clever little mechanical tricks, the Swiss railways decided to keep the pause because they had unintentionally created something very beautiful. Mondain, a Swiss watchmaking company, even made a watch that would emulate that pause. And Hans Hilfiger thought it was kind of a joke. Like, there's no reason for a watch sitting on your wrist to do that, but even he admitted that it was kind of charming. And because of that, I think it's a skeuomorph, which is a concept I've talked about in a previous video. It's an allusion to the ingenuity of the past kept alive today because of heritage, because of pride, or simply because it's familiar. When it was designed, it represented the future. And even though the clock has been quietly updated with precise timekeeping components synced to satellites and controlled by computers, this 1.5 second pause remains as a reference to the past. And that's beautiful. Hey, thanks for watching that video. I've been wanting to do it for a very long time now. One thing that I wanted to mention, which I couldn't really fit inside the video itself, was the reason why I'm into this clock. Back in 2012, Apple released iOS 6, and the iPad version included for the first time a clock app. But the clock app had a face that looked suspiciously like the Swiss Railways clock. Now that's a problem because Mondain had at the time an exclusive license to create reproductions of this clock, and Apple apparently didn't have a license to do that. And so Apple and the SPB settled for some amount of money, and Apple got a license to use this face in their app. And I always thought that was kind of weird and quirky.